There is a kind of silence you don't hear. You feel it deep in your chest, like a presence in the room that doesn't ask for permission to exist. And you mistake it for loneliness, because your mind was trained to label anything quiet, anything unclaimed, anything unoccupied as lack. But what if it's not loneliness at all? What if it's something far more unsettling? A woman alone in her space, not waiting, not searching, not breaking, not performing for emotional survival anymore. That kind of stillness doesn't fit inside the stories you were taught. You were taught to misunderstand her, to assume that a woman alone is incomplete, unfinished, missing something, waiting for someone to arrive and fix the timeline of her life. But you are looking at her through a broken lens, one shaped by dependence, urgency, and emotional noise that you mistake for love. Because the truth is, she is not waiting for life to begin. Life already began when she stopped outsourcing her peace. She is watching life stop performing for her approval. And for the first time, she is not reacting. She is observing. She is no longer chasing emotional certainty from unstable hands. She is no longer adjusting her personality to stay emotionally chosen. And that makes people uncomfortable, because people don't fear her silence. They fear what her silence reveals about their own noise. You've been conditioned to believe presence equals validation. That if someone is not constantly reaching for you, touching you, choosing you, confirming you, then something must be wrong. That if a woman is not attached, she must be abandoned. That if she is not pursued, she must be forgotten. That if she is alone, she must be waiting. But her silence is not emptiness. It is structure. A rebuilt inner world that no longer collapses under emotional inconsistency. It is awareness. A mind that finally stopped mistaking intensity for intimacy. It is a nervous system no longer addicted to chaos, no longer mistaking anxiety for connection, no longer confusing unpredictability with passion. And here is the part your mind resists the most. She is not alone because she has no one. She is alone because she stopped abandoning herself just to stay close to someone else. That is not withdrawal. That is awakening. That is the moment the internal war quiets down, not because life became easier, but because she stopped negotiating her self-worth inside relationships that required her to shrink. And that decision rewires everything. Her attention no longer leaks outward for validation. Her thoughts no longer spiral around who chose her, who didn't, who stayed, who left. Her nervous system stops scanning every room for emotional safety like a survival reflex. Instead, something rare begins to happen. She starts returning to herself without fear. Not because she became emotionally distant, but because she stopped abandoning herself in pieces just to remain emotionally available for others. And in that return, she begins to notice something terrifyingly clear. Most of what she once called love was actually self-abandonment dressed in familiarity. So the silence grows deeper, not hollow, not empty, but structured, deliberate, alive. And anyone who truly listens to it understands. She is no longer trying to be held together by external presence. She is learning how to hold herself without breaking. Strange happens when a woman stops needing to be chosen. Not in a dramatic way, not in a loud awakening. It is quiet, almost invisible at first. She simply becomes harder to read. Not colder, not detached, just no longer leaking emotion for approval. You would think she becomes distant, that she pulled away from life, that she built walls. But in reality, something far more subtle happens. She becomes present in herself. And presence like that is not passive. It is revealing. It exposes everything unstable around her without her saying a single word. Because need loud. Need has urgency in its tone. Need explains itself before it is even questioned. Need negotiates, pleads, adjusts, shrinks, just to keep access to connection. Need is always performing emotional maintenance to avoid abandonment. But a woman who lives alone long enough starts to lose that noise. Not because she becomes numb, but because she stops feeding the emotional patterns that kept her in survival mode. And when the noise disappears, what remains is uncomfortable truth. Not about other people first, but about herself. She begins to see how often she mistook inconsistency for depth. How often she called emotional confusion chemistry. How often she stayed longer in uncertainty just to avoid the silence of being alone with herself. And in that clarity, everything starts to rearrange. She stops asking, "Do you love me?" Because that question was never just about love. It was about reassurance. It was about external regulation of internal fear. And instead, she started, Art's asking something far more honest. Do I feel safe in my own energy? That shift sounds small, almost insignificant. But internally, it is a collapse of an entire old system. Because the nervous system that once depended on external validation for stability no longer runs the same program. It stops scanning faces for approval. It stops interpreting silence as rejection. It stops turning distance into self-blame. And slowly, something new forms in its place. A regulated inner state that does not require constant emotional input to feel secure. That is not emotional detachment. That is emotional sovereignty. And it destroys entire patterns inside her nervous system. She no longer confuses attention with love because attention can be inconsistent, performative, even temporary. She no longer confuses pursuit with value because being chased does not mean being understood. She no longer confuses attachment with identity because being connected to someone is not the same as being connected to herself. And you might not realize this yet, but that is a form of psychological freedom most people never reach in their entire lives. Because most people are still emotionally negotiating their worth in real time. Every interaction becomes a silent transaction. Am I enough here? Am I being kept? Am I about to be replaced? That constant inner negotiation is exhausting, but familiar. So they call it normal. But she is not negotiating anymore. There is no internal bargaining left, no emotional shrinking to preserve access, no rewriting herself to remain acceptable. And that is why she feels different now. Not because she became distant, but because she is no longer emotionally available for instability disguised as connection. She sits in silence, and nothing inside her panics anymore. No urgency, no chasing, no emotional collapse in the absence of attention. Just awareness. And in that awareness, she appears untouchable, even when she is not trying. G to B. When a woman lives alone long enough, her environment stops being decoration and becomes reflection. Every corner of her space starts speaking back to her. Not in words, but in truth. A chair she always avoids looking at. A mirror she passes too quickly. A room she keeps for later, as if parts of her life can be postponed without consequence. It all starts to feel alive in a different way. Not comforting, not romantic, but honest. There is no distraction strong enough to override her awareness. No relationship noise to dilute her thoughts. No emotional chaos to delay her reflection. No external presence to pull her away from what she has been postponing inside herself. So she meets herself fully, and most people don't understand what that really means. Because they imagine solitude as peace, soft music, calm mornings, clean thoughts. But real solitude is not aesthetic. It is exposure. It is standing in a room where nothing interrupts your patterns anymore. No, ni to blame. No one to explain yourself to. No one to emotionally escape into. Just you and everything you avoided while you were busy surviving connection. Because meeting yourself is not peaceful at first. It is confrontation. You start noticing how often you abandon your own comfort. Not once, not occasionally, but repeatedly, almost automatically. As if your nervous system was trained to leave you behind whenever attachment enters the room. You see how often you override your intuition just to keep something alive that was already draining you. How often you stay where your body feels tight, heavy, unsettled, and call it loyalty instead of self-neglect. How often you silence your inner warning signals because silence feels easier than change. And it does not feel poetic in the beginning. It feels uncomfortable, restless, honest in a way you cannot escape, but she stays. She does not rush to fill the space. She does not immediately replace silence with distraction. She does. She's not escape herself through noise anymore. And slowly, something shifts inside her perception. The discomfort stops being punishment and becomes information. This is the turning point most people never reach. Because when discomfort becomes information, you stop running from it. You start listening to it. Her loneliness turns into data. Not emotional collapse. Not identity crisis. But feedback. Her silence turns into clarity. Thoughts that were once chaotic begin to organize themselves without interference. Her evenings stop being empty and start being revealing. She notices patterns she used to romanticize. The emotional cycles she called connection. The inconsistency she called chemistry. The anxiety she called care. And without distraction, those illusions cannot survive. And this is where transformation begins. Not when life gets louder, not when someone arrives to change her, not when validation finally appears from outside, but when she stops escaping her own. In mind, when she stops treating self-awareness like something dangerous. when she stops abandoning herself just to stay emotionally comfortable. Because the truth is simple, even if it feels heavy. You were never afraid of being alone. You were afraid of what you would realize when nothing distracts you from yourself. And once that realization is met instead of avoided, the entire inner structure begins to change. Not loudly, not suddenly, but permanently. At some point, something inside her breaks, but not in the way you think. It is not heartbreak, not abandonment, not loss. It is recognition. A quiet, irreversible moment where clarity finally rises above emotional noise. She sees the pattern, not as theory, not as advice, but as lived truth repeating itself across time. The emotional loops, the same types of conversations, the same endings wearing different faces, the same disappointments arriving with slightly different words, and most importantly, the way she used circa. Onection to avoid herself, not because she didn't care, but because being alone with her own thoughts once felt heavier than staying in something unstable. And once you see a pattern clearly, you cannot unsee it. There is no innocence left in repetition anymore. No comfort in pretending it is just bad timing. No softness in ignoring what keeps showing up again and again. Clarity removes the illusion of randomness. And that is where something deeper begins. The old identity starts to collapse. Not all at once, not explosively, but layer by layer, silently losing relevance inside her own awareness. The version of her that tolerated inconsistency dissolves. Not because she became cold, but because her nervous system finally stopped normalizing confusion. The version that confused intensity with intimacy fades. Because intensity without safety starts to feel like internal chaos, not connection. The version that called anxiety love starts to die quietly. Because love that constantly destabilizes the mind is no longer interpreted as romance, but as internal alarm. And this process is not dramatic. There is no cinematic breaking point, no visible collapse, no external moment where the world pauses to acknowledge her transformation. It is silent, no applause, no validation, no external confirmation that she is changing. Just a slow, internal separation from everything she used to tolerate. Things she once explained away no longer require explanation. Things she once endured no longer feel negotiable. Things she once rationalized now feel unmistakably misaligned. And this is where most people misunderstand her transformation. They assume strength is built through endurance, through holding on longer, through trying harder, through staying consistent in situations that keep breaking you. But that is not what is happening here. She did not become stronger because she learned to handle more pain. She became stronger because she stopped acting, pinging what weakens her. That is not endurance. That is discernment. And discernment changes everything. Because once you can clearly identify what destabilizes you, you stop calling it destiny. You stop calling it fate. You stop calling it love. You call it what it is, misalignment. And you step back, not in anger, not in revenge, but in awareness. And awareness is irreversible. That is why her transformation cannot be reversed by apology, attention, or temporary change in behavior from others. Because the shift did not happen in her circumstances. It happened in her perception. And perception, once awakened, does not return to sleep. So she no longer argues with patterns she already understands. She no longer negotiates with cycles she has already decoded. She no longer confuses repetition with hope. And this is where evolution begins to take shape. Slow, quiet, almost invisible to the outside world. Because evolution does not announce itself. It removes what is incompatible with truth. And what remains is a woman who is no longer learning how to survive emotional instability, but learning how to refuse it completely. There is a moment in her journey that cannot be reversed, not because she became perfect, not because she figured everything out, not because life stopped challenging her, but because she became aware. And awareness, once it arrives fully, does not ask permission to stay. It settles in the nervous system like truth that cannot be unlearned. She now sees through emotional manipulation disguised as love. Not as suspicion, but as clarity. Not as paranoia, but as recognition. She feels instability before it even forms, before words shift, before behavior changes, before distance becomes obvious. Something in her body already knows. She recognizes energy before words are spoken, before explanations arrive, before stories are told to soften reality. And once awareness reaches that level, you cannot return to unconscious living. Because unconscious living requires forgetting. And she no longer forgets what her body has learned. You cannot unsee what you now feel. That is the threshold she crossed. So she stops returning to what once broke her, not out of anger, not out of pride, not out of a desire to prove anything, but out of clarity. And clarity is quieter than emotion, but far more permanent. It does not argue. It does not chase closure. It does not rewrite the past to make it softer. It simply sees and chooses differently. And here is the truth that unsettles most people. She does not need saving, because she stopped abandoning herself in places where she had to be rescued. She does not need completion, because she stopped treating incompleteness as something another person must fix. She does not need permission to exist in peace, because peace is no longer something she negotiates for. It is something she maintains internally. What she needed was not someone to arrive and change her life. What she needed was removal. Removal of confusion. Removal of patterns that repeated pain under different names. Removal of relationships that required her to shrink in order to stay. Removal of everything that kept her disconnected from herself. And now she has it. Not as a reward, but as a consequence of awareness. So when she sits alone in her room now, it is no longer emptiness. It is alignment. Not loud, not dramatic, not performative. Just quiet internal stability that does not depend on anyone else entering the space. It is a nervous system no longer bracing for emotional damage. No longer preparing for inconsistency. No longer scanning for signs of loss. It is a mind no longer negotiating its worth in invisible conversations, no longer asking for proof, no longer interpreting silence as danger. It is a soul that stopped asking for permission to be whole, and that wholeness does not announce itself. It simply exists, calm, unshaken, undemanding. And maybe the uncomfortable truth of all, she was never becoming someone new. She was not being rebuilt into a stronger version. She was not being upgraded into something rare. She was simply removing everything she was never meant to carry, and what remained underneath all that noise was already whole. So understand this: solitude is not punishment, it is revelation. When a woman stops running from herself, she stops needing validation from the world. She no longer confuses chaos with love or attention with value. She becomes anchored in her own awareness, and that changes everything. The lesson is simple but uncomfortable. You do not find yourself in others who remove everything that was covering you. And when that noise disappears, what remains is clarity, strength, and quiet power. Not because life became perfect, but because she finally stopped abandoning herself to survive it.